The following program is brought to you courtesy of a grant provided by the Bank of Princeton.
Good evening, I'm Lou Goldstein, and welcome to another edition of Focus On. Tonight my guest is Dr. Julia Sass Rubin, who is one of the founders of Save Our Schools New Jersey and has been instrumental in pushing for legislation to reform the current 15-year-old charter school legislation in New Jersey. We are going to take an examination of the recent developments of the charter school legislation and efforts by individuals and by organizations to look at ways to reform the current law and see exactly why it needs reforming and exactly what the current status of legislation in the State House is right now. So Julia, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
It's good having you on.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, I just want to say before we get started that so everybody knows who you are, Dr. Rubin is an assistant professor of public policy at the Edward Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. And I know you've worked with many individuals there who have done good work in analyzing public schools and charter schools and performance and basically everything that goes on there. And I know you earned your doctorates from Harvard University and your MBA from the Harvard Business School and have done a lot of research and worked with a lot of different foundations and corporations over the years. But more importantly, tonight I hope we get a good discussion going about what's going on in the state of New Jersey in charter school legislation. But first I thought it might be helpful just to talk about what is Save Our Schools New Jersey, what's its purpose, what's its mission.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction. So, well, Save Our Schools New Jersey is a grassroots, nonpartisan group of parents and other concerned residents who really care about public education. And we started, about 9-10 months ago in a living room in Princeton, New Jersey, where 5 or 6 of us were sitting around just very concerned about what we saw as a very serious attack on public education all across the country. But we were really focusing on what was happening in New Jersey. And we were concerned not only because we all have small children and we value public education on a personal level, but because the high caliber of New Jersey schools is just a real asset. We are one of the absolutely best school systems in the country. We consistently come in first or second on every measure. And it is the reason people move to New Jersey. And the research shows that there's 2 reasons people move to New Jersey, right? One of them is access to jobs, because we're between New York and Philly, and obviously there's a lot of jobs in the state itself. And the second is because of our high caliber public schools. So we had both, I guess, macro reasons for being concerned and very personal reasons for being concerned. So we formed Save Our Schools because we felt that the parents' voice was really missing from a lot of the conversations that were going on. And we wanted to make sure that the legislature was hearing from parents, because we were told by legislators that we spoke with that they really didn't hear from the parents and the voters, and they didn't think people were following or paying attention. And we decided, because we were so grassroots, we were not even incorporated, we weren't going to become a 501c3, we wanted to stay very close to the ground, so to speak, that we had to just pick a couple of issues that we thought were the most critical and most damaging potentially to public education, because between full-time jobs and children and busy lives, we couldn't handle a whole panoply of issues. So the 3 that we felt were really particularly critical and where we all agreed were funding our schools. And New Jersey is, as you know very well, is one of the few states that really distributes resources in such a way that low-income students have, or at least are intended to have, adequate funding to provide a thorough and efficient education as our Constitution requires. And we wanted to make sure that every child was adequately funded. And that, for us, meant funding the formula, which is designed to ensure that every child is adequately funded regardless of where they go to school. And that formula, which was created a few years ago to replace the Abbott decision, has not really consistently been funded. So one of our concerns was to try to address that. Our second concern was vouchers, which there's been a persistent effort to open the door to introduce publicly funded vouchers that would pay for private and religious school tuition in New Jersey. And it's been going on, as far as I know, at least 15 years, because that's how the charter law began, was as an alternative to that. And we see them as a really destructive and very negative policy that we really would hate to see occur in this state. And the third area that we wanted to focus on was charter school reform. And we are not against charter schools. In fact, my daughter attends a charter school, as do a number of our members. But we felt that the New Jersey charter law was really broken in 4 ways. And so we wanted to target those 4 areas that we thought really needed addressing. And I think we're going to spend some time talking about that. But anyway, just to come back to Save Our Schools. So we started with this policy agenda, and we started just reaching out across the state. And we went in 9 months from having 6 parents in the living room to basically having members in every one of the 40 legislative districts in this state. So what we found is that parents care a great deal, and we weren't the only ones that were concerned. So it's been really an incredibly energizing experience.
Well, it has to, and more people I know are signing on, as a grassroots movement, and people are starting to understand it. But there's still a lot of people who really don't understand the basics.
Right.
And I think let's talk about those 4 areas.
Sure.
And let's talk about
I think
why.
in terms of charter school reform.
Yeah. Let's talk about why like folks like the Education Law Foundation has come out, advancing it. So it's not just one organization. I don't want anybody to think it's just one organization pushing reform. There's a lot of individuals and a lot of people writing about this, saying that when it was created, it had a purpose, but it's outgrown its purpose, and we need to update it to. It's now 2011, and we need to really focus on the needs in 2011 of what's going on. So I think it would be good just to talk, first of all, maybe about legislation that's currently pending. Right. I know recently there was a bill put forth providing for, the need for voter approval of any charter school that is thought to be, starting in any specific area within the state. Right. And I was wondering if you had any update on that and, where it is right now.
Right, well, so I mentioned the 4 areas of reform that we've been working on. So one of them, as you alluded to, is the fact that New Jersey has a law that we think is broken. It is unlike any other state's law when it comes to charter schools. So there are 39 states and the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico that have charter school laws, or at least as of a couple weeks ago with this legislative cycle, there's a lot going on, so maybe other states have adopted it. But of those 39, New Jersey is the only state, the only one that has no local control over the approval of new charter schools, no cap on the absolute number of charter schools, and yet expects local communities to pick up the entire cost. Okay. And in case some of folks viewing this or don't understand how charter schools work, charter school funding, as you know, comes from the traditional public school budget in a community in New Jersey. Each state has different charter laws, obviously, so I'm just speaking to New Jersey. So 90% of a district's per pupil spending, so everything that really directly affects education, would transfer to a charter school when a child goes from the traditional public school system to a charter school. And that sounds like it's a very good deal, right? Because the public schools get to keep 10%. But of course what happens is that if 3 students leave a classroom and 5 students leave another classroom, there's not really any cost savings to the existing traditional public schools because the fixed costs don't go away. You still have the same number of teachers, you still have the buildings, you still have the furniture, all those. So the variable costs that leave with the child are really so minuscule that in effect the district is losing all the revenue, but they're not really losing any of the costs.
Right.
So it's a big hit to the district.
Right.
And the way the New Jersey law works is anyone can apply to start a charter school. They don't apply to the district. They apply directly to the Department of Education. We are the only state that completely ignores local wishes and yet expects that community to pay for the school. In every other state, about 1/3 of all states, only local communities can authorize charter schools, whether it's directly through a vote or through the school boards. In the rest, if the state authorizes a new charter school or if a nonprofit authorizes it, they pay for it.
Yeah.
And at the very least, the few states that don't have either of those, they have a cap. In New Jersey, you could have 200 new charter schools started in any given cycle, as long as there's enough applicants. And the local communities really have no say. The law ostensibly allows for local input, but there certainly have been many, many instances where local communities have expressed strong displeasure with the possibility and have been ignored. And with the increase in the number of applications in this last year, because the governor's very open about the desire to increase the number of charter schools, there's been a significant uptick in the number of applications and in the last round of approvals. There's just a lot of anxiety and frustration and anger across the state. And this has really boiled over in individual communities in very unproductive ways because people feel very left out of the democratic process. It's their property taxes that are primarily funding those schools. New Jersey is one of the states where local taxes fund most of our local education, as you know.
Yep.
And that's not necessarily true everywhere in the country, but it's definitely true here. And especially when you get into the suburban districts, as charter schools are spreading in this state, increasingly into suburban districts, those districts are paying a really large portion of their local education budgets. So the local taxpayers are saying, wait a minute, it's my property taxes that are paying for the schools. My traditional school is being significantly affected, but I have no say in whether the school opens. And so I'll give you an example of the kind of anger that's mounted. So there's a charter school that was approved by the Corzine administration a couple years ago that was supposed to open in West Windsor, South Brunswick, West Windsor, Plainsboro, South Brunswick, and Princeton to draw students from those three communities. And the school was not able to open at the end of the first year, and they got another extension. And then this time they're also having some zoning issues, so it's not clear that they're going to be able to open. A petition was started a couple of weeks ago online by residents of Princeton, West Windsor, Plainsboro, South Brunswick. Within 48 hours, they had collected 700 signatures saying to the Department of Education, do not reauthorize the school. We do not want the school. Within 5 days, they had 1,200 signatures. So this is just 3 communities, and to have that level of anger and passion is really not healthy for the charter school if it does open. I mean, as a charter school parent, I'm looking at this kind of from 2 standpoints. As, you know, this is bad policy to ignore the wishes of the voters and the taxpayers, but also when the school does open against the community's wishes, that creates so much hostility, and that just cannot be good for a community. You're seeing it in Newark. There was a meeting held, a week ago?
Yep.
1,000 parents turned out to protest the fact that the district, under the state's control, is forcing existing traditional schools to co-host charter schools in the same buildings. You know, people just feel so disenfranchised, and I think that's what you're seeing also in the suburban communities now with this very kind of top-down structure of the law. So that's a very long-winded way of explaining the context. So one of the reforms that we have been working with the legislature on, and I know you had Assemblyman Dykeman on a few weeks ago, who is a tremendous ally of public education, and he really has been working on this legislation on the Assembly side. On the Senate side, actually Senator Greenstein introduced this legislation when she was still in the Assembly, and then Senator Turner and Senator Bono have picked it up, and Senator Greenstein has joined them, and we have now 10 bipartisan 10 senators of both parties, obviously, who are who are co-sponsoring this legislation. 14 Assembly people, again, bipartisan coalition, co-sponsoring this legislation, and this would give local communities the right to decide if a new charter school should open or draw students from their community. So sometimes the charter school is not in that community. Right now, Hillsborough has 2 applications that may draw students if those 2 schools are allowed to open. They may draw students from Hillsborough, and for example, if this law was in effect, those schools would be drawing from multiple communities. If Hillsborough had the right to vote and they said, the voters said, we don't want our children to be eligible for those schools, we don't want those schools to be able to access our kids, they would have that right. The schools could still open if other communities wanted them, but it would give Hillsborough taxpayers and voters the right to decide about their children and their schools. It's their taxes, it's their kids.
And I think one of the important things is not just Hillsborough, but East Brunswick has had
absolutely.
its issues, Highland Park,
Milburn, South Brunswick.
All around the state. Yeah. So it's not something that is focused just on one area.
No,
people can say,
not at all.
It's happening over there, not in my backyard.
No.
It's happening all over.
All over.
And the goal really is to have a uniform policy which is applicable throughout the state.
Absolutely, and that's our goal.
So where's the legislation right now? Has it been posted, or do you know?
Yeah, so the bill has come out of the Assembly Education Committee, and there were no votes when it went through the committee, and it has, next it should go to the full Assembly for a vote, and Assemblyman Dykeman is pretty confident that it's going to come up for a vote this in the next couple of weeks, maybe even as soon as Monday. And
Hopefully by the time this airs.
exactly. The challenge is, of course, it needs to get posted in the Senate Education Committee, which is actually meeting tomorrow. And that committee is chaired by Senator Ruiz, who has not indicated that she does not approve of the bill.
Right.
And in fact, of her 5 committee members, 2 are co-sponsors, including a primary co-sponsor, but she has not put it on the agenda. And of course, the committee chair controls whether a bill comes up or not. And until it gets posted in her committee, it can't come up for the full Senate. We are confident that this bill would do very well. We've had no one in either chamber who has said they oppose the bill, because the voters are very, very supportive of this legislation. You mentioned Milburn. We had 3 rallies yesterday, actually last night, across the state to show the kind of public engagement on this issue and on all the charter reforms, which I know we'll talk about the other ones as well. We had a rally in South Brunswick, we had a rally in Highland Park, and we had a rally in Milburn. And the Milburn rally drew on Maplewood, South Orange, Livingston, Milburn, and Short Hills. And we had 100 and 150 people in that rally, I think about 300 in Highland Park and over 100 in South Brunswick, on a night when there were multiple graduations and lots going on. And so people really care. And they're calling and they're letting their legislators know. And so we're hopeful that we'll get, we want to vote. We want to know where people stand. There's an election in November. If they don't agree, that's their prerogative as a legislator, but we don't want backroom deals. We don't want any legislative maneuvers. We want an honest vote so the voters can hold their legislators accountable for whichever way they decide to go. That's how it's supposed to work in a democracy.
Well, it makes sense, especially if you're paying property taxes. And you want to know if those property taxes are going to the schools and what is the cost. Because ultimately, a good public school helps real estate values.
Absolutely.
So if people are saying, why should I be worried about charter schools, they should think about the real estate values, the public schools that are around them, and saying, you know what, don't want to have my property value diluted. And I think there's a correlation there, if you do an examination of it.
Right. I think, charter schools are public schools in New Jersey. I think it's really a question of how does a community decide how to allocate its resources, right? I mean, in theory, it would be wonderful if each child could have their dream educational scenario,
right.
But then we would all have to, multiply our current taxes by 10 or 20 times. Obviously, there's not a lot of support for that. So given that we have a limited pool of resources, we make these decisions as communities, because public schools are communal assets. They don't belong to each person in a small dose. They belong to all of us, and it only works if all of us make those decisions jointly. Otherwise, you really are talking about vouchers, right? If every person gets to take their little pot of money and go and do whatever they want, then we're destroying our amazing public school system, which was set us back as a country by over 100 years. We didn't always have public education, right? We used to only educate the wealthy.
Yep.
And my gosh, that would be a horrendous loss. It's inconceivable that we could go back like that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about those 3 other areas. I think one of the areas I want to touch upon right now is fiscal accountability. A lot of the charter schools who have failed, there's been lack of fiscal oversight and regulations there. And I just wanted to know your thoughts about that. And where does fiscal accountability come in? Should charter schools be playing by the same rules that public schools are playing by, since they are considered public schools, and be subject to, say, things like the 2% cap, and other things? I was just wondering whether SOS has taken a position on that.
Right. Well, the other bill that we have been working on encompasses pretty much all our other reforms, and this is a bill that also has been introduced in the Assembly Education Committee and has come out of that committee. This is a bill that was co-sponsored by Assemblyman Catino and Assemblyman JC, and it really has sort of there's 3 broad areas of reform that we are advocating for that are encompassed in this bill. Okay. And one of them really speaks to what you just mentioned around transparency and accountability financially, and you're right, the schools that have been closed have often been closed less for their academic performance than for financial malfeasance. So as public institutions, we do feel very strongly that charter schools should be held to the same high level of accountability and transparency as you would expect from a traditional public school or really hopefully any public institution. So one example would be, for example, if you wanted to know what private money is being donated to a charter school, you should be able to see that information. And some charter schools in New Jersey are fantastic about that. They really make that information readily available, but not all are. And that should really be codified, we feel, in the legislation, so that there's a requirement to do that, because again, there are public dollars going into these institutions,
Right.
and they're educating our kids, which is honestly much more critical even than the public money. So that's one piece of it, is greater financial transparency and accountability. For example, anyone that gives over a certain amount, I think in the bill it's $1,000, any organization or individual would have to disclose, the charter school would have to disclose who the donors were, so people could see. There's also educational transparency and accountability, so that we know how students are really performing and who those students are. Right now, we don't have the ability to track performance and correspondingly who the students are in terms of, are they limited English proficiency students? Are they special needs students? Are they extraordinarily poor students who are receiving free lunch? And those are very important variables, because you need to understand if charter schools are educating the same population, and you need to understand how that population does. Right now, we can't say, the Department of Education does not release that data in terms of, for example, if a child is getting free lunch, which means they could be homeless, they could be that poor, or they're getting reduced lunch, which means they could be working class. And that's a huge divide between a child who is potentially homeless and a child who is in a family that is certainly challenged financially, but they're not anywhere near that destitute. And it has significant impact on their academic performance. There's a big divide between how kids do between those two groups, free and reduced lunch. So that's just one example. We should be able to divide those two groups and look at performance in charter schools for each group of kids. And really, we should be able to track children individually. For example, some charter schools have very high attrition rates. Not all. Some schools do a fantastic job of holding on to the kids who come in. Others have really strikingly high attrition rates, which make you wonder if in fact there's some encouragement for certain children to leave, and if in fact that has something to do with the test results that they're getting. So if you see a school where the test results are improving every year, that could be that they're doing an astonishing job educating those children, or it could be that they're just pushing out the low performers. And that's where you really need to be able to say which children are leaving and what's their performance. And we just don't have access to that kind of data right now. So professors of education in New Jersey can't do the analysis. And that just doesn't make any sense. So that's another area of transparency and accountability. And the third set of reforms that we've been working on is also in this bill, which is that the population of students demographically that charter schools educate are pretty different from the population that traditional schools educate. They tend to be less poor than the surrounding districts. They tend to be much less likely to be limited English proficiency, much less likely to be special needs. And that's a function of the way that students are admitted. It's not that the schools are not inherently doing anything to cause this, but charter schools that have more demand than supply. So if you have 100 spots and you have 101 students applying for those spots, use a lottery system. And I know you know all this.
Well, everybody else does it.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is the point. We're trying to educate everybody about what's going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that lottery means that a parent has to go and apply for the school. I mean, even without the lottery, a parent has to apply.
Right.
And what that means is that you are already selecting out the most motivated parents and the parents that have the resources to know about the schools and to apply. And that tends to screen out parents who are extremely poor because they are busy just keeping their families fed and clothed and housed. And it also tends to screen out parents who don't speak English, for the obvious reason that it's very difficult if you don't speak English to maneuver, to understand the system well enough to know where to go and to apply and to fill out the forms. Special needs students, I think often their parents are consciously choosing not to apply, or after they are admitted, they may be choosing not to stay because they find that the charter school can't meet the needs of their kid as well as the traditional schools can. But the other two groups are probably just not applying. Certainly the data seems to indicate that. And what that means is that the traditional schools are left with these three populations in disproportionate numbers. That's bad socially, obviously. We're segregating our children. But it also has tremendous fiscal consequences because these are all more expensive to educate than the child that doesn't have any special needs, speaks English well, and is, say, middle class. And so you're congregating the most expensive to educate students in the traditional public schools, but you're taking a lot of the money away to send them to the charter schools. And as we discussed earlier, the money leaves, the revenue leaves, but the expenses don't. So this is obviously problematic because the children who have the most needs then are left with fewer resources to address those needs. So what this legislation is trying to do is, it's actually kind of a novel concept that Representative Malone came up with while we were having a hearing some months ago. He's from the 30th District, a Republican Assembly person, and he suggested, what about using an opt-out lottery instead of an opt-in lottery? In other words, any parent in a district their child would automatically be entered in a charter school lottery if there is a charter school that serves that district, unless the parent says, I don't want them to be entered. And if by some chance a child's admitted and the parent didn't realize what was going on, they would obviously have the option to say no. But this way, parents don't have to be able to go and apply. They don't have to know about it in advance. And hopefully it would equalize the characteristics of the population at the charter school and those at the traditional school, which I think everyone thinks is a good idea. In fact, all the reforms I've just been talking about, except for the local control, the vote,
right,
are also supported by the Charter School Association. They really agree that these are necessary and good reforms. And the high-performing charter schools tend to do at least the transparency, the financial educational transparency, but unfortunately all the charter schools are not reflective of their sending communities because of the lottery. It's not, again, it's not that the schools are inherently discriminating. I'll give you an example. So Princeton Charter School, which is a wonderful school in Princeton, which my daughter attends. The Princeton Regional Schools have 102 limited English proficiency students between the grades K and 8. The Princeton Charter School right now has 0. So it's just an example of the kind of discrepancy, and I know the Princeton Charter School is not intentionally trying to keep those kids away, so it's just the mechanism is not optimal.
Okay. Now, as we look toward the future, we look in our crystal ball down the road, where do you see the work of SOS New Jersey going, and where would you obviously like to see things going as we wrap it up for tonight? Because obviously there's a lot of legislation out there. Hopefully some will get through, but yet the work of the organization needs to continue.
Yes.
So as we look to the future, what will be the focus of the organization?
Well, I think we're just going to keep on moving on these 3 fronts. There's a lot of work to be done. We've actually heard rumors that the voucher bill that has been fighting to get in for over 15 years might be snuck in through backroom deals in the last couple of weeks of the legislative cycle, which would really be terrible. Vouchers are opposed by a strong majority of voters in the state. Quinnipiac did a poll in late April and found that 56% of New Jersey voters thought that vouchers were a bad idea and only 39% supported them. So this would really be, if this happens, it would really be against the voters' wishes and really destructive to public education. I have to just throw out one other tidbit. I'll give you an example. The bill that was proposed some months ago and that came out of a couple of committees in the Senate, for every child that left the traditional public school system to take a voucher, let's say in Camden or in Asbury Park, the voucher is only worth $8,000 or $11,000 depending on the grade level. The school system loses $16,000 for every child that leaves, which is just devastating to those schools. I mean, there's a million reasons why this is a bad bill. So we're trying to keep these kind of backroom deals from happening, and I'm sure that this will be an ongoing need. In terms of defending public education, we don't like the idea of turning public schools over to for-profit management companies, and I'm sure that is not going to be popular with the voters either. So that's an area that we are focusing on. We are continuing to advocate for additional funding for public education, and of course charter reforms. We've got a lot of energy. We're pushing that rock up the mountain, and we're finding that more and more voters are joining us.
That's great. That's great. Well, it's great having you on tonight.
Thank you.
Julia, it was great having you. I know
Thank
your
you very
daughter's in the
much.
studio. I want to wish her a happy birthday. I know she had a birthday recently.
Absolutely. She just turned 9 a couple weeks ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And before we go, I just want to say thank you, and it was very informative. And hopefully we'll hear more about it, down the road, get some updates and see what happens.
Absolutely. And our website, if your viewers are interested, is www.saveourschoolsnj.org. And they can sign up on the website for updates, legislative updates, and action alerts. We send very few, so they won't get flooded.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching tonight. This is Lou Goldstein for Focus On. Stay healthy, stay informed, Get out there, and we'll see you next week on Focus On. Have a good night.
This program was brought to you through a grant provided by the Bank of Princeton.